I'd been going to Russia for a number of years. We had helped to plant a church in St. Petersburg. And we had had 3 young children. Laurie was home with them. They were 5, 3, and 1, or even a little bit younger. And there were numerous times where I'd go to Russia for a month at a time while Laurie was in the most difficult season of a young mom's life. I got a phone call this one day from the head of the ministry in St. Petersburg and said, "We've had a blow up. I need you to call Washington, D.C. You need an expedited visa. You need to get on a plane in 3 days. We need to go there together and deal with this issue." So I just said, okay. I went to Laurie. I said, "Sweetie, I got to get on a plane. I got to go to Russia." Got my expedited visa, got on the plane. We dealt with the issue. I was only there for a few days, came back. We're about 30,000 feet over Greenland on this Delta flight. And a movie was on that was called The Bridges Over Madison County. It's an old movie. It's got Meryl Streep and Clint Eastwood in it. And he's a photographer, and there are these beautiful bridges in Madison County, Wisconsin. And Meryl Streep plays this wife, this mom, and she's just existing. She's really not even alive. Her heart is just dead. It's shut down. She's got a husband that takes her for granted. She's got kids that take her for granted. And the husband and the kids are going off to a fair somewhere else in the state. And she's by herself, and Clint Eastwood is lost. He comes and knocks on the door and asks for directions to this certain bridge. Well, they strike up a conversation. There's some electricity in the air. And it ends up being just a torrid affair. And so much so that before her husband and children get back, she's going to leave because she feels like she's come alive. So it's the night that they're going to leave together, run away together. The bags are packed. She's cooked a romantic dinner for the two of them, Clint Eastwood, Meryl Streep, and she's just playing with her food. And Clint Eastwood knows something's not right. He says, "What's going on?" She says, I can't do this. He says, "What do you mean you can't do this? How many people do you believe have experienced what we've experienced over the past several days?" She says, "Oh, I'm sure very few in the world have experienced this." He says, "So what's wrong?" She says, "Well, I don't imagine you'll really understand this, but let me try to tell you." She said, when a little girl is growing up, she looks at her mom and her dad, and she begins dreaming about the day that she'll become a wife. She has all these desires, what it will be like and what the guy will be like, and like a knight in shining armor coming in to swoop her off her feet and take her off into wonderful magical lands. And a girl grows up with those dreams. She dreams all the time. She says, "Well, at least I did." And then it happens, and you meet that guy, and you get married. And she said, for most women, they come to realization early on that there's a sense in which when you marry, all the dreams you had die. Because you begin to get engaged in helping to fulfill the dreams of your husband and your children. And that becomes your new dream. And she says, "I can't leave. I can't kill the dreams of my husband and my children. And I also realize that in their dreams, I'll find my dreams. I can't do this." Well, during this whole conversation, 30,000 feet in a seat on a Delta plane over Greenland, I come to the realization that I am weeping like a baby. I mean, not just tears streaming down my face, but I mean, I'm embarrassed because there's people around me just seeing me convulse. And I said, "Lord, what is going on?" And it was almost like Nathan to David, "You are that man. You are that man that has taken your wife for granted. You are that man who has presumed upon your wife." Now, Lauren had a great marriage, but I realized, and again, the gospel gave me the freedom to let down my guard and to allow the voice of the Spirit to speak and say, "You're that man. You're taking your wife for granted." So I got out a piece of Delta stationery and I started writing out a letter of repentance to Laurie. I realized that if the gospel was really going to free me from my pose, I needed to come completely clean. Not just between me and God, but between me and Laurie. So I wrote up this letter. And we got home, and I was afraid to give it to her. I was back in Genesis 3. I was hiding. I was trying to keep my fig leaves in place. And the Spirit was just saying, you've got to do this. So I take out the envelope and I say, here, sweetie, read this. And I run down in the basement, jump in the car, and say I have to go to the store. So I ride around for about 30 minutes, 45 minutes. The last thing I want to do is go back and face my wife. I mean, I'm going to be completely naked, right? I'm going to be exposed. So I walk up the stairs, and I know she's heard the garage door, so I know she's probably standing in the kitchen. I crack the door. I'm like a little kid. And I look over at my wife, and there are tears just streaming down her cheeks. And she looked at me, and she said, this draws me even more to you. This is not weakness. This is strength. And it draws me to repentance as well. Now, God used that experience to change my preaching. That I decided right there that I was going to be a preacher that made sure that my congregation never thought that I was the guy who had it together. And that if they tried really, really hard, then they could have it together like me. But I decided that I was going to be the chief repenter in the church. And that I was going to be vulnerable and risk transparency. And there have been people who've left the church at Oak Mountain because they thought, I'm too transparent, I'm too vulnerable. I can't follow a preacher that doesn't have it together. But I will tell you, I've had scores of people say, Bob, you may be a good teacher, but what really draws us to Jesus is not when you teach well, but when you let down your guard and you let us know that you're a man who deeply needs the gospel, and that the gospel of God's grace frees you from your facade. And then it frees us from our facades, and we find ourselves repenting to our wives and to our children and to one another. And it's no more a bunch of poses cracking into each other, but it's true, intimate fellowship. And it becomes a culture where the DNA is we don't have it together. And the DNA is we desperately need Jesus. And it creates mutual tears. And it creates a breeding ground for further repentance, where Jesus is looked upon with hope. And that's, ironically, what actually leads to life transformation. I'll never forget that moment. It's still emotional even as I share it, and it changed my life.